Our speaker tonight is Michael Earley, who is a member of the famous family, and tonight Michael is going to tell us all about the early windows, stained glass windows that are in County Tipperary. But now, without further ado, I hand you over to Michael.
Good evening. We'll start off with just saying I began this study as a bit of a family history more than anything else, and knowing that I would have to study it properly, I decided to set myself a goal. So I signed up with the National College of Art and Design and did a PhD, which I was successful in getting last year. So the study became a proper study, and I can now call myself an academic instead of a jobbing surgeon. So, Early Studios in Tipperary. First of all, I'm going to give a bit of structure to the talk. I thought it would be useful to cover what is stained glass first, give a brief history of Early Studios, and then talk about the windows I found in County Tipperary, and a little bit about how stained glass window is actually made, and a few more Tipperary windows, and a few little epilogues that are relevant. I'll spend a tiny bit of time on this, and I'll be asking questions later. Glass, the actual glass is made by melting silica sand at 1700 degrees centigrade. Now that's a huge temperature, and it was a very long time before anyone could reliably do it. So what they used to do was they would put in additives such as potash or soda. So you will hear people talking about soda glass or potash antique glass. And they were able to melt at 900 degrees instead of looking for 1200. They fashioned large brick furnaces into which they put small pots filled with silica sand. And that silica sand melted into glass. So it became known as pot glass, P-O-T. And if you added different metallic oxides, you were able to get different colors. So the glass itself became stained. And you might use gold chloride to get a ruby red, or cobalt oxide to get a deep blue. So the glass is not painted glass, it's colored glass. So pot antique glass is proper stained glass. Now, if you want to get shading and detail, and if you want to do folds in cloaks or shading on faces and hands, you painted that on with what was called glass paint. Now, that glass paint, when it was put in a kiln and fired, became black. So the color in a stained glass window is from the glass itself, and only the shading has been painted on using various techniques. If you use enamel paints, as was very popular in the 1700s and the 1800s, you were able to paint on glass like a painting. But this would be frowned upon by stained glass artists. I'll show you an example of painted glass. This was one we saw in Trinity Church in Boston. Boston has a fantastic collection of stained glass, if you're ever there. But the whole thing about this is that it's painted. This is not the glass itself, but it has been painted, and the colors have been painted. So it's not stained glass as such. Whereas on the other hand, if you look how red this is Sister Margaret Mary and the Sacred Heart appearing before Sister Margaret Mary. This theme dates from her own writings in the 1600s, and she was popularized by the Jesuits and eventually canonized. But this window is in Upper Church. It's a beautiful, beautiful window. Dates from 1928. There is St. Michael on the left and St. Gabriel on the right. It is a glorious example of stained glass used in a very imaginative way. So that's painted glass versus stained glass. We know what we're talking about now. Now, the Earley family themselves, we'll just have a look at this. That's what I'm going to be talking about. The great exhibitions of 1851 and 53, the beginnings of Earley Studios, their competitors, and the changes throughout Camden Street in Dublin, and the output of Earley Studios. Now, looking at this rather interesting collection of shields, James Earley was born in 1788. I know this from his death cert. He died in Birmingham of tuberculosis, as many emigrant Irish did. He came from, we think, Drumshambo, from Leitrim, and he married a good West Midlands Birmingham girl, and they had children. There are lots of lady children, but I'm afraid I'm being very sexist and non-politically correct. I'm just following the ones that went into the business. Thomas Earley and his brother John were the two brothers born of James Earley and Elizabeth. They were born in Birmingham, so they were known as the Birmingham Earleys, but they were of an Irish father. The Birmingham Earleys worked for a company called John Hardman's, who were stained glass and metal workers. They became very noted because of Pugin, the Gothic architect. A.W. Pugin, he was busy in the 1830 to 1840s. In stained glass, he began doing stained glass designs for John Hardman and convinced John Hardman to do stained glass in 1845. Thomas Earley was an incessant writer and left a whole heap of wonderful letters, which are now in the Birmingham Library archives. And he wrote in a very personal kind of way, and he wrote about his problems with tic douloureux, as it was known, pain in his face, and all sorts of stuff, and the terrible crossing across that awful sea between Holyhead and Dublin. He would write about typhus in Leicester. And they're very, very real letters. A whole other topic. So the two sons, as representatives of John Hardman, went to Dublin because what was happening at that time was the great exhibition of 1851 in London. And all of Pugin's works and John Hardman's works were shown there. The foreman was Thomas Earley, and we see him resplendent in his sculptor's smock. So Thomas Earley was put in charge of preparing the Pugin exhibition part of the great exhibition. This was very successful. So they thought, there's another exhibition coming up in Dublin, 1853. So they went to Dublin and were inundated with orders. So in December 1853, Hardman's opened a supply shop in Grafton Street. It's now a Vodafone shop, in case you want to trace it. The demand for statuary, altar decoration was so huge, and there were so many stained glass commissions, that they bought premises in Camden Street in Dublin, and they stayed there for the next 120 years. Their stained glass at that stage, as you can see here, Earley and Powell's in St. Kevin's Church in Dublin, was very standard, Pugin-influenced Victorian stained glass, very like what Hardman and Company were doing. But Earley and Powell's, two Powell brothers, began doing glass much the same. They were a big company at that time, and this is a photograph from the Irish Rosary, 1901, showing the glazing studio. Now, I will talk about a William Earley. That is William in his young days, in 1901. He was my great-grand-uncle, and this was him working in the glazing and glass painter's shop. I call it shop. It was the gallery as part of Early Studios. They had to have a large kiln because I mentioned to you earlier painting on glass and putting in the details and the shading. You had to fire those in a large kiln. So around about 1905, this photograph was taken, and this is a blow-up of it. There is William Earley and his older brother, John Bishop Earley, who had taken his mother's name as Bishop. So to stop confusion, because like a lot of Irish families, there's John the First, John the Second, John the Third. So John Bishop Earley he became. What I find funny about this is here's the bowler hat and the felt hat and the cap. The cap, the glazier is wearing the cap, but the two bosses are wearing the hats and are dressed for work. Now this is a blaze of orange and red light. This window is still there. It is in Camden Street and it is still in the studio. In 1893, Thomas Earley, the founder of Earley and Powell's, he died, and his nephew, John Bishop Earley, the one in the hat, became manager of the studios. His younger brother, the one in the bowler hat, joined him, and in 1903 they set up Earley and Company. They moved into a larger premises and continued to expand. And in 1931, they were probably at their largest, just in time for the 1932 Eucharistic Congress. So the 1930s, 40s, and 50s were the most productive years in the studio's history. Vatican II, my father described it as if a tap had been turned off. There were almost no commissions in stained glass of that type after Vatican II got going. So the last windows in Early Studios were done in the very early 60s, and that was that. So who are their competitors? I'll run through this fairly quickly. Their competitors in the late 1800s, 64 to 93, Earley and Powell's, they were mainly German and English glass imports. They were the big competitors. Mayor of Munich were the ones that were churning out glass at a very reasonable price. And Templemore Sanctuary area has a lot of Mayor of Munich windows. They're good examples of them, and some people are very disparaging of Mayor of Munich windows. The ones in Templemore are actually quite good. They're nicely done. John Hardman was still competing with his own branch that he had set up, and there were some French studios as well. But in the main, Earley and Powell's almost had a level playing field to themselves. So they did very well then. In the late 1890s, someone had come over from England called Joshua Clark. He worked for Early Studios initially, And then in the 1880s, he set up on his own. And in the 1890s, he was a significant competitor in Dublin. And skipping ahead slightly, by the 1910, 1920s, his son, Harry Clark, was a complete game changer, a highly imaginative artist whose output was very, very low indeed because of his short life. Harry Clark died when he was only 41. So they were the competitors. You had Cox's, Cox and Buckley, and then they became Watsons of Youghal in Cork. There's a Watson's window in Templemore as well. Thomas Earley died in 1893, and John Bishop Earley, as I said, continued the business in his own name. And in 1903, with his younger brother William, they formed Earley and Company. This was no accident. At exactly the same time, Sarah Purser opened Untour Glynna, which was another direct competitor. So essentially, in Ireland, or certainly in Dublin and the Midlands and going up further north, you had Earleys, Clarks and Untour Glynna. And going further south, you had Watsons of Cork, who were Cox and Buckley, and then you had Campbell's in Belfast. And that was it. You know, by and large, there were very few imports after that. Later, 1944, Dublin Glass and Paint Company set up, and they became Abbey Studios. And Abbey Studios are the only ones that are still there. And they have only survived because of the fact that 90% plus of their work would be restoration work and refurbishment of existing glass. They do very little original glass. As far as isolated practitioners of stained glass, there would be, I don't know, about 10 in the country, and they are all very low output, but extremely good. If you want to look at the two differences between Harry Clark and Earley's, this is very typical Earley's, this is very typical Clark. Clark would be edgier, more modern, as it was felt to be. But his faces, very stylized hands. Earley's were noted for the soft features. And many priests who were looking and in charge of commissions preferred this to the Clark style. So it was proper competition. The academics of stained glass have different opinions about this and would regard this as more artistic and this as more traditional and therefore less innovative. I have my own totally biased view. Putting bricks on the structure I've been talking about. This is 1932. The Bishop of Tarbes in Lourdes was visiting, or a cardinal he was. And there's my grandfather, and this is what early studios looked like. And that was that coloured window I showed you, the circle. That, thanks to the local preservationists, has survived and is still there. In the 1990s, it was looking very sad indeed, broken windows, the place was derelict, it was all boarded up by the year 2010. And then, this is an artist's impression, but I'll show you a picture in a minute. And one has to say that Weatherspoons did a wonderful job. Whatever one feels about Weatherspoons as a business or as purveyors of beer, they have always reconstructed the buildings they have gone into. And they spent millions on refurbishing what used to be Earley Studios. Now, Earley Studios was that bit, and all the Muse buildings and gardens behind. This was a convent of the Sisters of the Poor, and this used to sell Jaguars, Cavies. It was a car manufacturers and sales shop. That's what it looks like now, the Keevans Port Hotel. I'm glad to say the window still survives, and if my father was alive today, he would recognize all of that and he'd automatically walk through the gates and go into the studio. They at least kept all of that. So you can still see what early studios looked like. Where are their work? This is constantly changing. This was in November 2024. I had a total of 233 sites around the country. I now have 240, and Tipperary has 10 sites now, not 9. And it's just of interest to let you see how widely spread that is. Now, these are sites. The number of windows this represents would be well over 800 windows. Now, the windows that I've discovered in Tipperary, and I am always wide open for additions to be given to me, because I have by no means traced them all. And before anyone asks me, what about the business records? The business records were unceremoniously dumped by my father and his uncle when the studios closed. So there is only a smattering of archives left, some of which I have and some of which are scattered around various parishes, and some of which are in the National College of Art and Design. I have to thank Eugene Short for the ones relating to Upper Church. So Mount St. Joseph Abbey in Rossgrey has an amazing collection of early studios windows. Now the collection stops at around 1904, but up till then they have a huge collection of them. St. Cronan's is like a history of early studios. There are older windows from Earley and Powell, there's newer ones from John Bishop Earley, and there's others from Earley and Company. And the same goes for most of the other churches. I will cover some of these in detail, but you can run down along them. Since Peter and Paul in Clonmel has a huge collection of early windows. And what one has to put up with as you start researching this is that they're nearly all described as from Clark Studios. I think you'll probably see why, but it's really just because of the use of small leads and small glass and lots of detail and very, very rich colours. That's why they're confused. But no, they're very, very different. So if you are going to make antique pot metal glass, I'll just show you some of that. It is blown glass, it's also called. And it is literally made in the way it has been made for hundreds of years. You have molten glass, and you have a worker who, with a thing called a pontil, blows the piece of glass. So at this end, there will be always a round piece of glass with a mark where the blowing instrument was inserted. And you will see those on windows sometimes as round glass with a lovely design just in them. And that's why they exist. This is called cylinder glass as well, because it's blown as a cylinder. And if you just pour the glass into a slab or into a mold, it's known as Norman slab glass. So the muff, as it's called, the cylinder, is split along one side and put into a heating oven where it slowly flops out as a sheet of glass. So that's how it's made. It's blown as a cylinder. It's meant to show you the wide variety of colours. Well, the reds and the oranges are amazing in this. So Earlys were not like the big factories of glass like Mayer of Munich and Hardman's in England. Earlys were essentially very close to the arts and crafts principle, of where you had a designer who cartooned the window, drew the life-size drawing for it, and who supervised every single bit of the fabrication. So there were only 4 designers. One was Thomas Earley, way back in the late 1800s, then John Bishop Earley, then William Earley, and my father, Leo Earley. What you might find interesting are that when a commission was requested, as this one was in St. Cronan's in Roscrea, William, in this case, did a design in watercolour and sent it to the priest. And this design, depending on the autonomy of the priest, may be handed on to the bishop or the archbishop or whoever had total control over the windows that were going to be put into St. Cronan's. They would make a decision based on these watercolor drawings. Now, for you to understand, this is a blow-up of one of those watercolors. This is what the finished window looked like, and this is a detail of that window. These are in St. Cronan's. As far as I know, and forgive my ignorance on this, but this is Saint Rita. She is usually depicted holding a crucifix. She is the patron saint of wives, of widows, and of ladies in difficulty. So she is very apropos. And this is St. Cronan, and here is the watercolor sketch, the window, and a detail of the window, so you can see the design. William would draw these life-size. The whole cartoon would be drawn life-size. And he used charcoal for that. These are very specific charcoal crayons. They're quite firm. This is one of my father's windows. That's in St. Peter and Paul in Clonmel. And you can see the beautiful detail around the wings and all of this. He was very influenced by Clark. So you are forgiven sometimes for thinking that's a Clark window. The one in Knocknavilla in Dundrum, there's the cartoon and the finished window. So the cartoon was actually used by the glaziers to make sure they had all the right pieces in the right place. A giant jigsaw. And you could tell the different styles in the different artists. Thomas Earley's, lots of acanthus leaves. John Bishop Earley, he liked columns with crisscross fascisti on them. He liked to do peacock feathers on the angels. William Earley liked to put stars in clouds. It was nearly like a signature on his windows. And my father, Leo Earley, used to do lots of detail, very Clark-like. So the more you know about the windows, the more you can place them in time, because not every window has a proper date put on it. The glass paint that I described to you, it is a mixture of ground glass and iron or copper oxide, and that's painted on. Now, the techniques of painting were very skilled indeed, and Gerald O'Byrne was one of the best. I remember him. I used to do my homework in the studios He showed me how to mix glass paint one time. But when you're mixing it, it has to be mixed as if you were mixing cement. You have a piece of dry glass paint and you pour in water and a little bit of gum, which makes it stick to the glass as it's being coloured. There are different ways of brushwork, using badger brush, and you can scrape it. You know the way you do scraper board? You have a black sheet and you scrape it off and you end up with light bits. Well, that's exactly how this works on glass paint. The details are extraordinary, and acid can be used to burn out some of the colour, and it's hydrofluoric acid used to be used, and to get that colour yellow graded across, you would use silver stain, which was silver oxide. When all the glass had been painted, it was assembled and leaded. Now, looking at two in particular, I'm sorry to step on anyone's toes when I say this is an example of misplaced good intentions. It is a magnificent cathedral. It's lovely. But the early stained glass windows are in each transept and are far too high to be seen. And it is a great, great shame because they are beautiful windows. And if you look at them in detail, there is huge detail to be seen. And the one of Our Lady is Stella Maris, the Mary Star of the Sea. There's the sailing boat. I mean, the imagery in it is wonderful. I owe a huge amount, when I was doing my studies, to Father Lawrence Walsh, who I'm going to visit tomorrow in Roscrea. He did this magnificent book of all the windows in St. Joseph's Abbey. And I would recommend this book. It really is wonderful. Earley and Powles did windows there from the 1881 right up to 1903. And there are 27 windows of Earley's in it already, altogether. So they vary in style, obviously, from very old Victorian type, 1881, to a more modern 1903 at the time type of design. So just a couple of epilogues. In 1939, there was the World Fair. Now, the timing of the World Fair in New York was not great, because 1939, the World Fair had to come to a hasty end because of, in September 1939, half the nations that were exhibiting at the World Fair were actually at war with each other. But this was William Earley's design, a very typical one of Earley Studios. The window that won the Best Window Prize at the 1939 exhibition was a magnificent window called The Four Provinces by Evie Home. And that window is now in government buildings. Every time there's something like a pandemic, it's the stairs they walk down to tell us the bad news. You can see the Four Provinces window behind on Taoiseach. So what was the whole reason for Earley's and why were they so successful with the Catholic Church? Because they were almost exclusively Catholic Church. You will find very few Earley and Company windows in the Church of Ireland or the other established churches. William Earley himself always said, "We try to interpret the spirit of the church when she calls on her artists to illustrate the written word." He believed he was answering the Bible. He was answering a holy call. That was his personal belief. Catholic work had to be devotional. He wanted to be able to recognize and for the public to recognize the spoken word of the Gospels. In other words, like a second sermon, this time in glass. The keynote to all of their work was small pieces of glass to make it look jewel-like, brilliant, and a variety of colours. But the one thing it always was, and since we're talking about their competitors as well, stained glass had to be a window decoration that had to let light through. So in other words, you could not have dark light coming through or dark windows. And God rest his soul, if Harry Clarke had a fault, the windows were dark. And there are some churches with Harry Clarke windows where there is very little light coming into the church. The windows are sheer genius, but the amount of light coming through them is not great. Another little epilogue to give you. There's my great-granduncle William Earley. There's my father, my mother, and myself being educated how to make a jigsaw. And finally, a legacy. Our son James has, God help him, gone into stained glass as a designer as well. And you will recognize Clonmel, and you will recognize the Church of St. Peter and Paul. And this was a piece he did outside the church, a mural. I don't know how it's faring. I don't know whether it's still there or not. But he did this a few years ago. So James is now the 7th generation of early artists. Thank you very much.